You're listening to Life, the Universe, and Everything Else. Today on the show, Palestine, Part 2.
Life, the Universe, and Everything Else explores the intersection of science and society. Original music is produced by Ian James, and this episode was edited by Marissa McCool. Find her on Patreon at patreon.com/QAF.
Heads up before we start. We are talking about the history, politics, and current situation in Israel and Palestine. If that's not something that you are up to today, especially since this is a blanket trigger warning for basically everything, we understand if you give this one a miss.
My name is Jem Newman, and joining me today I have Lauren Bailey,
Hello.
Ashlyn Noble,
Hello.
and Laura Creek Newman.
Hi there.
So just as a marker for everybody listening, we're recording this second part of our episode on Thursday, September 19th, 2024. That is 2 days after the start of the series of pager and other communication devices exploded in Lebanon, an attack that Israel has apparently taken credit for. We won't be talking about that this episode, but just in case our listeners are wondering when this was recorded, in case it's relevant for later context. So I'm going to pass things off to Laura, who's going to tell us a little bit about the water security situation in Gaza right now.
I'm actually going to talk about both food and water in Gaza. And I'm going to do a very broad review because we could do multiple episodes on these topics alone if you want to get into it and if you want to start looking at the numbers and that. But I want to talk about both of these because food and water are pretty vital to every human being's survival.
As we said on our first episode, everything we say will necessarily be a brief summary, and we encourage our listeners to check out the show notes for references and further reading.
Thinking about the things that we as humans need to survive every day. As I said, food and water are top, aside from having enough oxygen to power our brain cells and our blood cells and all of that. We need food and water just to keep these bodies going, to keep these brains churning and these hearts pumping and all of that. We need enough food and water, and we need good quality food and water. That means food and water that's going to meet our needs and not contribute unnecessarily to disease or illness. I really wanted to talk about this because as a dietitian, my job is to talk about food. I do talk about water and hydration, but not nearly as much. Partly because here where I live, for the majority of the people I know and that I work with, hydration is as easy as turning on a tap and drinking as much as you want. It's here, it's available, it's free in most places and for purchase, but I don't talk about that too much. Now, the same cannot be said for everybody in the province that I live or the country where we live. But it's not something I deal with. Food is something I talk about a lot, and food insecurity is something I do deal with on a pretty regular basis. And we know more and more contributes to so many of the challenges that we see both in healthcare and just in greater society. When a population is not able to be well nourished, it suffers, and social problems ensue, political problems ensue. A lot of humanity's problems stem from food. Now, it's not the only cause, but if you don't have good food and enough food, you're going to have problems. And I wanted to talk about this because as a dietitian, I was taught that food insecurity can happen to some people, but that's not really my realm. If you want to, you can get into those spaces, but that's not really, I don't know. My job is to deal with the food and talk about the specifics. It's not to deal with the problems of getting the food or why there isn't enough food. But as a lot of great dietitians have been pointing out especially as the conflict and the atrocities in Gaza and the West Bank have been raging over the last few months. They've been pointing out that with this food insecurity and forced famine in many cases, this is a problem. And how can we do jobs like be dietitians if there isn't even any food? And so if there's food involved, we should be advocating for enough food for everybody.
It strikes me as analogous to something that a lot of doctors have been calling for as well in places like Gaza. You can't have a precursor to health is access to healthcare, just like a precursor to nutrition is access to food.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that those of us privileged enough to go to post-secondary and then to get to work in these fields as professionals sometimes forget, because it's rarely a part of our day-to-day lives. So let's talk a little bit about food security and food insecurity. The Food and Agriculture Organization, which is a branch of the United Nations, defines food insecurity as a person being food insecure when they lack regular access to enough safe and nutritious food for normal growth and development and an active and healthy life. This may be due to unavailability of food and/or lack of resources to obtain food. They might have access to food to meet their energy requirements, yet they are uncertain that it will last, or they may be forced to reduce the quality and/or quantity of the food they eat in order to get by. This moderate level of food insecurity can contribute to various forms of malnutrition and can have serious consequences for health and well-being. When we think of hunger and famine, we often think of the types of images that I would see on those infomercials for, goodness, what's that? What were those Christian charities where you could sponsor a
World
child?
Vision?
Yes, thank you. Think of the images that we would see of people, children especially, that are clearly malnourished and really, really troubling images. We think of hunger like that. And that is the case in Gaza particularly. We are seeing images just like that. The vast majority of people who are suffering malnutrition do not look like that. The vast majority of people are in this moderate food insecurity space where maybe sometimes they have food. Maybe it's not enough food, but they have food. Maybe they only have one type of food, and so they're going to get deficiencies if they're not able to get a variety of food. Because one thing that we all need to know about humans is, despite what maybe some interesting groups of people might tell us about the best diet, humans actually need to eat a pretty wide variety of foods. We can get by with a lot of things, but we still need a fair variety to get all the nutrients we need. So if you don't have access to even the minimum variety, you can get malnourished and develop disease because of it. The vast majority of people who are food insecure or who are experiencing this, part of that experience is the fact that they just don't know when and where the next meal is going to come from. They can't be sure what's going to show up on the plate or in the store. They can't be sure if they can buy enough for today and tomorrow, or for the next week, or even for today. That is the vast majority of food insecurity, shall I say, significant problem-causing food insecurity that's likely to result in health and social consequences in pretty rapid order. So why am I talking about food insecurity? Well, if anyone's been following along with the news out of Gaza, we are hearing that food insecurity is rampant there. At present, 60 to 80% of Palestinians in Gaza are food insecure, at least moderately, if not severely. And with the inability of organizations to even bring in the barest of nutrition necessities through aid, that number is only going to get worse. Even before this, though, food insecurity was completely unequal between Palestinians and non-Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories. So in all of Israel, about 16.2% of people were considered food insecure, which is pretty comparable to 16.9% of Canadians. both of which are pretty horrendous numbers for quote unquote first world countries and high economic power countries. However, within Israel, there were pretty big disparities. So when looking at Arab communities, typically the food insecurity went up to 40%. So that's a pretty dire change from the Israeli average. Again, though, that's pretty similar to the rate in Canada's Indigenous communities. So when we're looking at communities that are subjugated and are unable to access the basic needs that everyone else gets, we see food insecurity happening. So why is there so much food insecurity? Well, that's a huge question to begin with. I'm going to talk about Gaza for a minute and then expand. I'll talk mostly about Gaza, but I'm going to go back and forth between West Bank and Gaza as well. So in Gaza, prior to 1948, it was pretty sparsely populated. It was a pretty small population, and it was pretty agricultural. People were able to do a fair amount of subsistence farming. They had access to a fair amount of land, and they were able to feed the people who lived there. However, after 1948 and the significant decrease in the amount of land for Gaza, and then the subsequent increasing of population, as we've talked about, and as many places have reported, Gaza is one of the most densely populated places on the earth, it meant that there was significantly less land to grow food and significantly more people to feed. So there was a double whammy of increased demand and decreased production. Over in the West Bank, many farmers began to lose access to their farmlands due to barricades, blockades, Israeli settlements, and other restrictions on movement. And so even people who still technically had farmland, like they still technically had land, they couldn't actually get to it to farm it or to cultivate their crops. Increased blockades of building and farming materials and supplies also made it a lot more difficult for farming and for food production to happen. So when we talk about these blockades, there's a lot that is and is not allowed into Gaza in particular. And in the West Bank, it's a bit of a different story. But in Gaza, there's a lot of things that are not allowed. A lot of these things are pretty innocuous. However, they've been deemed dual purpose, meaning that the Israeli government has decided that some of these implements can be used for things like infrastructure and agricultural maintenance. They can also be used for building bombs, and therefore they're not allowed to enter Gaza. So, for example, equipment to build and maintain pipe systems for water systems was not allowed to enter because it could also be used in defenses or terrorist attacks.
Like, I was expecting that this would just be they're worried about a Timothy McVeigh fertilizer bomb, but pipes.
Yeah, it's
that's not even the most ridiculous one I've heard of. I remember early on when they were talking about stopping and searching all of the aid trucks that were trying to get through. One of the, I guess, drivers was giving an interview about how if they found, for example, a scalpel in a van full of medical supplies, that's a weapon, turn around the whole truck.
So we can understand how a lot of items, especially very basic things like packing materials or threads and fabric, could be used to make terrorism devices, or could also be used to, say, make clothing or all sorts of things that
I don't know, seems unlikely.
that might help with, say, food production or clothing somebody, or even making sacks to hold grain in, or packaging up produce to get it to people who aren't directly on the farm, or any number of things, right?
Right. And I think that it's important to just point out that the idea that they were specifically refusing to allow them things like water pipes and stuff is not an accident. Like they understand that they are preventing people in Gaza from making any sort of water purification or storage, anything like that. It's been explicit.
Yeah, it's often pretty targeted, And also when you cast, just the idea that you can cast anything that could have a dual purpose just opens up a net that is infinite, can capture anything you want it to at that time.
Mhm.
So this makes it really, really hard to both produce food and to move it around within the Palestinian territories or outside of the Palestinian territories. And this is where we need to remember that food is also a huge commodity, right? Canada is a huge food producer. Many countries are big food producers. And so that contributes to the economy. So it's not just feeding people, nourishing people, but it also contributes to the economy, which then goes back into the being able to have enough food and keep their systems and so on. So it's a cycle that just keeps having diminishing returns because of it. Food is also incredibly expensive in both Gaza and the West Bank. So West Bank food prices are quite high, and 82.5% of imports of food in the West Bank come from Israel alone. So there is a near monopoly on the provider and thus the price of food.
Mm.
So, of course, this happens. There's lots of states that rely on another state for a lot of their food for various reasons. So it's not that this in itself is bad, but the situation where one state is highly dependent on another and there are huge power differentials tends to create problems for the less powerful state. And so that's what we see. In many cases, food prices have risen, making food just unaffordable for many average Palestinians. And overall unemployment there is quite high. Therefore, they have lower spending ability too. So the average Palestinian has fewer shekels. Actually, I don't know what the unit of money, the currency is in Gaza or the West Bank. In Israel, it's shekels, but
Israel uses shekels.
In any case, they have fewer money units to go around, and each of those units buys less food than it would in other places. And so that in itself creates food insecurity. That's what we're seeing here in Canada as well. I've talked to people on a daily basis in hospital where that is becoming the case, or is getting worse because it's always been the case for them. Now, focusing more on Gaza, I was mentioning that it's tightly controlled what goes in and out. We've all heard about that, right? And how the crossings and what's been allowed in has been severely limited since this onslaught began. Gaza has been undergoing a siege of food since 2007. So there's something called the Red Lines policy. Has anybody heard of this?
I don't think so.
No.
Okay. So this was something that Israel vehemently denied existed until they were forced by the courts to reveal that, yes, in fact, they did have these policy documents. That was basically a document that outlined what could and could not go into Gaza and how much would be needed to allow the minimum amount so that people would not have a huge humanitarian catastrophe. So just above the starvation line and the just enough things to get by based on UN standards. So this
Actually, I've heard of the policy. I just didn't know the name of it.
Yeah.
Barely allow subsistence level.
Exactly. So this dates back to 2007. And this, if you recall, is around the time that Hamas took over. It's not exactly the timeline, but that's around that time there. And Israel withdrew all of its forces and citizens from Gaza and didn't like the fact that they had to do that, I'm going to guess. I don't know. Let's just conjecture. So, and this policy, while there is debate of how much, if at all, the policy actually was enacted, it was clearly drawn up, and there was a whole lot of math figuring out what is the average person's needs of every type of food and item. How much do we have to allow in so that they won't have a sudden collapse of stores, but so that there isn't a surplus or that there's an economical value to it, like its own economy could happen. There's a lot of that calculation. So I'll link to what I have of that policy in the show notes. Importantly, when doing these calculations, the Israeli policy estimated decreased needs for most food groups for Palestinians compared to the average Israeli, particularly for food groups that are high in nutrients like meats, milk, and fruits and vegetables. So they just need less than Israeli people do. Cool.
Seems legit.
Yeah.
I'm reminded, like, this is sort of classic racist stuff. You hear this in the history of healthcare all the time. Certain races feel pain less, so we don't need to give them the same doses of analgesics. It's not true.
Yeah.
but that is the line that is used.
Yep. Absolutely. So again, I am not a scholar on this. I don't know exactly how the policy was used, but we do know that after this policy was drawn up, fewer trucks of goods were allowed to enter Gaza than prior to this crossing, prior to the closures and the blockades by Israel. So it was estimated in this document that about 106 trucks of goods would be needed to go into Gaza every day in order to sustain like a bare minimum of life, and 77 of which were trucks carrying foodstuffs. But in reality, only 65 trucks were ever going in. So even with that underestimation, only 2/3 of that were actually entering the territory. And this is dating back to 2007. So for 17 years, the territory's been getting less than what they need. And they can't possibly produce enough to make up the shortfall. So not only this, but they also limited livestock that could go in. So only certain types of livestock could go in. And also they limited how many live animals could go in that would then be slaughtered for fresh meat. And so instead they allowed frozen meats, which does mean food goes in. However, when food gets processed, even frozen food, that means that there's slaughterhouses and there's food processors that need to get paid, which means prices are going to go up. So
that has to be really hard if your only source of meat is frozen and you have very little access to electricity and refrigeration.
Right, exactly. And so thinking about that, if you have intermittent electricity and brownouts, how much of your meat's going to spoil? So not only was the amount of food limited in Gaza, but the types of food were limited too. Just like they limited all sorts of other goods, they determined, and by they I mean the Israeli side, determined what foods were and were not allowed into Gaza. And of course, luxuries, quote unquote, were definitely not allowed. Let me read you a list of foods, just some samples of foods that could be allowed in as of May 30th, 2010. Fruit: apples, pears, banana, loquat, moist dates and avocado, apricots, plums, green almonds, kiwi, mango, pomegranate. You want a peach? You're shit out of luck. Vegetables: carrots, garlic, pumpkin, and onion, green leaves, so coriander, dill, parsley. You want a cucumber? No way.
That is not enough veggies.
Yeah.
I'm putting more veggies in a single salad.
So frozen vegetables were allowed, but this is how detailed it was. So peaches and cucumbers, these are just examples, were considered not allowed or luxuries, and people in Gaza couldn't just get them because they might want a cucumber, for example. And the list goes on. I just thought that was funny. Also, tahini was considered a luxury. So hummus that contained tahini was not allowed in.
What?
Wow.
This bit I love. This is so funny. There's a special section that says permitted for donations and international organizations and only. So aid, basically. So only international aid organizations are allowed to bring in vitamin-enriched biscuits, bottled water, and tomato paste.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Because all of the chefs do eat, but I don't know how to make a soup without some fucking tomato paste. Come on.
Yeah, like that. The tomato paste in there is a very funny one to me, in that terrible way. But the list goes on. This is all just to illustrate how intense this siege is. So, and when you go back to that idea of that food insecurity, it's about not being able to get enough variety to meet your needs, right? But that's not all, folks. See,
Laura,
as much as there were, what's that?
I was wondering if the meats that they were allowed to bring in, if they were halal meats.
They didn't say specifically, but for that, it seems like it's, yeah, I don't know. I can't make a comment on that, but there was no like bacon being forced across or anything like that, as far as I can tell, or from anything that I've read. Importantly, as much as there were some of these lists, more official lists, according to people on the ground, there were never really official lists, and what could and could not be brought in would change day to day, week to week for these vegetables and things. So interestingly, in 2008, I think it was John Kerry went to Gaza and was like, oh, they don't have pasta here. Why can't they have pasta? Because it was considered a luxury. But then interestingly, right after that visit, they were allowed to have pasta there.
Like when you get right down to it, this sounds like policing in general. Give somebody power and they will start making arbitrary rules just to exert that power.
Yeah, it's such a control, and especially with the rotating what will or won't be available, what will or won't be allowed. The people who are subjected to this can never feel a sense of security, and they're always on edge, and again, food security insecurity happens from this. There is a lot of allegations that what types of produce would go in and out of or into Gaza was largely determined by Israeli markets and what Israeli sellers needed to get rid of or needed a higher price for than the Israeli market would allow for. So, for example, there was a while where 3 of the food trucks needed to be containing melons because melon producers had a surplus and they needed to make a profit on it. They didn't want the Israeli market to tank.
Oh.
Yeah, and so it would fluctuate like that. Priorities. Yeah. So these are just a few of the reasons why there's so much food insecurity in these areas, particularly Gaza, but also in Palestinian communities throughout these territories. Now let's turn our attention to water. We talked a little bit about how bombs or pipes are from bombs, not water, apparently. And so that's why we can't have them there.
You can't bring the bottled water, sir. Why not? It's not bomb water.
But water is also something that's in scarce supply. Again, let's talk about Gaza first. When we think about Gaza, we talked about how the land available to the people living there shrunk and the population surged immensely. And so just like there's more mouths to feed, there's more people who need water, right? And so prior to 1948, the people who lived in Gaza had plenty of water. They used something called the coastal aquifer, which runs along the Mediterranean coast. It runs from, I think, up in like Jordan, Lebanon, like way up north, all the way down to Egypt. So it runs right along the Israeli coast, the Gaza, all of that, there, right through that territory. And so they drew from that for very long, hundreds of years, and were perfectly fine with it. But that was when there was 250,000 people living there, not 2.2 million people living there. We also have to remember, too, that when we think of water use for people, it's not just the water that we drink. So when you see how much water the average human needs in a day to meet their needs, it's not just the water that's going into their mouths whenever they're thirsty. It's the water that they use for cooking. It's the water that's included in the food that they make. Say that they cook cereal or pasta or soup or something. It's that water. It's the water that they bathe with. It's the water that is used to grow the food that they eat. It's the water that's used for washing and all those uses, right? So I found it helpful to remind myself and to think of that expanded water usage. And it's not just, 2 liters a day will do you. Well, no, you need a lot more than that just to be a human on this planet. So in Gaza, there's a lot more people drawing on this aquifer. Now, people of Gaza are not the only people drawing from this aquifer. Like I talked about, it stretches right along the coast there. So any communities living there had been drawing from this aquifer. And that included in northern Israel. And so Israel was drawing a large amount of water for many decades from this aquifer, partly because it was a good quality aquifer at the time, and partly because they didn't have other ways to get water. It was one of the bigger aquifers as well. Now, when it comes to aquifers, of course, they don't know or care about artificial state boundaries, right? And the general consensus is that states that share aquifers need to find a way to work together, and that there should be a fair use. So thinking about who is where, how much of your population is there, all of these things, and using the amount of water accordingly. Okay? And so there are claims that Israel is not abiding by a fair use policy and is purposely drawing from that aquifer. All in all, what has happened is they're taking too much. Yeah. And so what has happened is that aquifer is becoming depleted. Now, because this aquifer is right by the coast, what happens is because as the water is drawn out so rapidly, it creates a void. And so seawater from the Mediterranean starts to seep in. So over the last few decades, the remaining water in that aquifer is becoming higher and higher in salt, which means that it is becoming less and less safe to drink. And that's a problem, because that means that the people who rely on it are at risk if they're using that water. Also, because there's that void and because there isn't great waste management systems and so on, that aquifer is also becoming contaminated with things like nitrates. And so people in Gaza who rely on the well water have a much higher rate of kidney disease, for example, than people who don't, because their kidneys are getting damaged from the salts and the nitrates. So why can't they just find water elsewhere, right? Well, that's a problem when you've got a giant wall all around you and nobody lets anything in or out. So the easiest way to get water would be to import water from Israel, but that's been limited by Gaza restrictions. Even there have been some agreements for Israel to supply water to Gaza as part of the different humanitarian accords. However, it still hasn't met the needs, especially for a rapidly growing and young population. And so there's just been a constant shortage. And as much as it is easy to find sources that say or encourage Gazans to use less water, the reality is people are going to use the amount of water that they need to use. The people with the least access are still going to use water, and they're by far going to use less than those of us who have ample water coming out of the tap. So the average Gazan has access to 1/13 of the water that the average American has access to.
Wow.
Yeah. And to put that in context, most Israeli settlements in the West Bank have similar water access to most American or Canadian cities and towns. So telling people who already have less access to just use less is ridiculous. That's especially with these extra demands on it. I'm getting kind of preachy, sorry about that, but I'm just saying, like, this is human nature here, and these are people who are already necessarily using less than so many others in the world there. Desalination is a technique that's used by a lot of places that can't supply their own water, or they just don't have the aquifers to do it, or the rainfall, or whatever it is. And this made a lot of sense for Gaza. And the first desalination plant was planned in 2000 by the US, but the plans were stopped in 2003 for various reasons, mostly political and conflict. Even as these types of plants have got going, they have since built a few desalination plants. I believe there's been at least 3 official ones, one built by the UN, and then there may be some smaller ones that are unlicensed. I didn't have time to look into all of this, but even all of them combined weren't enough to supply water that was needed. So, for example, in 2017, the UN built the the big official desalination plant. And that's great. And it could supply enough fresh water for 75,000 people, which is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
There are 2.3 million people in Gaza.
Yeah.
75,000 is a small percentage of that, right? So it's amazing and it's wonderful, but it's not enough to do it. Over in the West Bank, the situation is a little bit different. The West Bank doesn't draw on the same coastal aquifer. There are different wells and aquifers there. They rely a little bit more on fresh water. One of the challenges, or one of the biggest challenges in the West Bank, is that many of the traditional wells for Palestinian communities were in places that are called Area C, or parts of the territories that are under full Israeli control, which equates to very limited access to the water. And it also means that they have a great difficulty getting more permits to build more wells, or to even increase the flow rate from their own wells that is within that territory. So how this turns out is that whole Palestinian towns will have no water running at all for days on end, even weeks. So when you go to that area, you'll see people have noted that you can identify the Palestinian communities by the presence of water cisterns on top of the roofs of the buildings. Israeli settlements very rarely, if ever, have those, because the water, there's a couple reasons, actually. One, water is not throttled from those same wells to Israeli settlements compared to Palestinian communities. And two, Israel has put a lot of money and infrastructure into building their own desalination plants. They have a national water service that distributes water throughout the country. They've done a lot of wastewater and reclamation projects, which, awesome, great. You're in a very arid area of a hot part of the world. These are great things that they've done. So they've actually produced a net surplus of water for their country now. And so they're able to have as much water as they want in all of these settlements throughout the West Bank. But Palestinian communities are not hooked up to that. In some parts of the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has actually built some water reclamation or desalination plants. And so parts of the West Bank have similar access to water, but they are unable to hook up their communities because of Israeli barriers and settlements. So Palestinians, again, just like Gazans, are forced to pay high prices to the Israeli water company to come and fill these cisterns for the times when their taps run dry. As part of the peace accords, there was something called the Joint Water Committee that was supposed to be created between the Palestinian Authority and Israel to help manage things like the coastal aquifer and ensuring that communities have water. However, it has been slow moving and very ineffectual. And again, a lot of it comes to the factor of one side has a lot of power and one side does not. And thus, Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza are thirsty and hungry for bad reasons.
Yeah.
Very well put together segment on an upsetting subject, but important to know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of upsetting subjects, let's talk about anti-Semitism. So, as listeners are surely tired of hearing by now, I had the honor of giving the valedictory address to the University of Manitoba's College of Medicine's graduating class of 2024. One of the most common objections, is that the right word, that I've heard to my valedictory address, mostly in the pages of right-wing newspapers, but also in the text of formal complaints to my regulatory college, is that my valedictory address was anti-Semitic. So let me say something right off the top. Anti-Semitism fucking sucks. It's real, and it's a real problem, and it fucking sucks. I will always call out anti-Semitism when I see or hear it. And I've done so in the past on the show and off the show, whether it's anti-Semitic 9/11 conspiracy theories, Great Replacement theory, lizard men, run-of-the-mill hate crimes, whatever else. Nazi punks, fuck off. etc.
There's at least a couple of times on this show where you have told me about new anti-Semitic tropes that I did not know. Well, not new, old.
Yeah.
Comes up, you call it.
Needless to say, I dispute the contention that my valedictory address was anti-Semitic. I encourage our listeners to judge for themselves. The whole speech is available on our podcast feed a couple episodes back. And when I was reached for comment by the press after my valedictory address, I called the claim that my words were anti-Semitic unserious. And I stated that the criticism of the actions of the Israeli government does not, in and of itself, constitute anti-Semitism. So the retort to my rebuttal that I've heard from folks who would like to defend the actions of the state of Israel at all costs is, we can define anti-Semitism however we want. And that's fair enough. I mean, any individual is, of course, free to define anti-Semitism or any other word however they'd like. Unfortunately, none of us is privy to the contents of anyone else's mind. So unless someone provides us with a working definition, we're all at a bit of a loss. We have to use language in a way that is mutually understood. So we have to either give up on communicating entirely or come to some sort of common understanding, right? The obvious problem I see with defining any criticism of the Israeli government as inherently anti-Semitic is that it gives the government carte blanche to do whatever it wants, no matter how unjust, without scrutiny. I would not want any government to have that sort of power, whether it's the government of Israel, the government of Canada, the government of the United States, any government. I don't trust a government as far as I can throw it, and I don't have a great throwing arm. This claim that criticism of the government of Israel is anti-Semitic also incidentally labels the countless Jewish people, whether they're Israeli or not, who criticize the actions of the state of Israel as themselves anti-Semites. So here I'm going to derail my own segment briefly for a bit of a tangent. I have spoken to several folks.
Whoa, wait a minute. Jem, a tangent?
I know. So I've spoken to several folks of Middle Eastern heritage who object to the term anti-Semitic itself because, basically on etymological grounds.
Right. The whole Arabs are Semitic people as well.
Right.
Thing.
So the term Semite, which translates to descendants of Shem, was originally an umbrella term for a person belonging to any of a variety of ethnic and cultural groups, including both Jews and Arabs. I remember one comrade at the University of Manitoba encampment saying, "How can I be anti-Semitic when I am myself a Semite?" So while Semitic as a descriptor has fallen out of favor in anthropological circles, it's still used in linguistics to describe the branch of the Afro-Asiatic linguistic family that includes Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic. So these are all Semitic languages. While this history, the history of the term Semite and Semitic, it's interesting, I don't think that this is a particularly strong argument, to be honest, as it seems to rely on a sort of linguistic prescriptivism that I find distasteful. See, any number of episodes where Lauren and I have gone off on wild tangents about linguistic prescriptivism. And in addition, as somebody who is not Semitic by any definition, at least as far as I know, it's not exactly my place to police anyone's use of language here. I'm happy to recognize the modern, widespread usage of anti-Semitic as interchangeable with anti-Jewish, but also recognize that many different ethnocultural groups can rightly claim to be members of the Semitic peoples. Anyway.
Yeah, this is definitely the goofiest argument. Like, it doesn't matter what you're calling it, the hatred is the problem.
Right. So I would contend, yeah, exactly, Ashlyn, as whether we use the term anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish or whatever, the question is, was my valedictory address, and the larger question is, are any of these criticisms of the actions of the state of Israel, governmental policy with regard to water and food entry into Gaza, or its governmental policy of annihilating more than 40,000 people, mostly civilians, in Gaza, are those worthy of criticism? And is that criticism anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish or whatever? So that's really the question here, regardless of what term you want to use. So in my valedictory address, I was critical of the actions and policies of a particular right-wing nationalist government that is currently engaged in a campaign of collective punishment of the Palestinian people. A relentless attack that has resulted in the deaths of more than 40,000 people, approximately half of them children. 2 months ago, is 3 months ago now, the Lancet estimated that when indirect mechanisms are accounted for, including communicable diseases, loss of healthcare infrastructure, and shortages of food and water that Laura has just finished talking about, the total death toll of this conflict, if you want to call it that, is expected to exceed 186,000 people. More recent estimates have revised that to well over 200,000 to 300,000 people. As of today, hundreds of medical workers, journalists, and even Israeli hostages have been killed by the IDF. Every single hospital in Gaza has been destroyed, damaged, or put out of service. Thankfully, some of them are now back in service. And Israel's blockade of Gaza is preventing the entry of medical and humanitarian aid, resulting in yet more preventable death. Surgeons have been forced to operate on children without anesthetic. Children continue to die of trivially curable infections due to lack of access to antibiotics. And polio is now resurgent. Multiple doctors in Gaza have reported that they have refused evacuation because they knew that since the seizure of the Rafah crossing by the IDF, new medical staff would not be permitted entry into Gaza to take their place.
That's horrific, right? Like where you're doomed no matter what you do. And so you might as well that's so awful.
Yeah.
I believe that accurately describing these events is not anti-Semitic. What is anti-Semitism? Now, I'm no expert on anti-Semitism, nor am I an expert on Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, or any other form of oppression. I'm just a white guy doing his best to make the world a kinder place. I would love to hear good faith feedback from listeners on this topic, but I have done a lot of reading on the subject, and I've spoken to many Jewish and Muslim friends, and I'm here to share what I've learned. There are two widely used definitions of anti-Semitism today. When you look for technical definitions, getting down to brass tacks, there are two main ones that you hear about. The first is the working definition adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016, often just called the IHRA definition. And then there's the definition outlined in 2020's Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. So the first definition, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism reads, quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities." I'll end the quote there, but that definition is followed by 11 contemporary examples of anti-Semitism. Many scholars and academics consider the IHRA definition to be more restrictive than the Jerusalem definition, which I'll get into in a second, in that the IHRA definition characterizes some forms of criticism of the state of Israel as inherently anti-Semitic. So the IHRA definition describes, quote, "holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel," end quote, as anti-Semitic. And it is absolutely right about that. Mm-hmm. If you hold all Jewish people as responsible for example, what's going on in Gaza right now, that is anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Don't do that. However, other examples of anti-Semitism that are included in the IHRA definition include both comparing, quote, "contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis," end quote, and, quote, "claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor," end quote. So that, I think, is less clear-cut. But they're claiming that the IHRA definition claims that if you compare what Israel is doing in Gaza, for example, or in the West Bank, to anything that the Nazi government did, that is anti-Semitic. Or if you say
a weirdly specific thing to carve out.
It's
You've seen too much. Oh, yeah.
it reminds me of I always think it's a drill tweet, but it's actually a tweet from comedian Mike Ginn. Quote, "My not involved in human trafficking t-shirt has people asking a lot of questions already answered by my shirt."
Yeah.
It's weird that you would need to bring that up.
Very specific. And they could have made it blanket, or like the Nazis, or Stalinist USSR, or Maoist China, or like all sorts of repressive things, but they were very specific.
So in any event, I would say that nothing I said in my speech would even contravene this description. I did call what Israel was doing genocidal. The Nazis aren't the only ones who did a genocide.
Yeah,
No, there's a
genocide.
whole bunch of them.
They've been happening for a long time. That's not their claim to fame.
Regardless,
About 3 going on in the world right now.
Yeah.
Right. This is the definition that is most commonly used, and a lot of critics of Israeli policy don't like this definition because it does serve to, I guess, protect Israel from criticism,
right.
And specifically protect the actions and policies of the Israeli government from certain types of criticism. We can contrast the IHRA definition with that of the Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism, which describes itself as a, quote, tool to identify, confront, and raise awareness about antisemitism as it manifests in countries around the world today. I'm going to describe the Jerusalem Declaration in more detail because I think it provides a clean, concise, and actionable definition of antisemitism, where the IHRA definition doesn't so much. I think it provides better, more actionable examples, and it also kind of firms up some of the edge cases in a way that the IHRA definition doesn't. And I think it's extremely useful for activists, scholars, and the lay public to know what antisemitism is and what it looks like. So I'm going to quote from their preamble here. Quote, "It was developed by a group of scholars in the fields of Holocaust history, Jewish studies, and Middle East studies to meet what has become a growing challenge, providing a clear guidance to identify and fight antisemitism while protecting free expression. The JDA responds to the working definition of antisemitism adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016. The IHRA definition, including its examples, is neither clear nor coherent. Whatever the intentions of its proponents, it blurs the difference between anti-Semitic speech and legitimate criticism of Israel and Zionism. This causes confusion while delegitimizing the voices of Palestinians and others, including Jews, who hold views that are sharply critical of Israel and Zionism. None of this helps combat anti-Semitism. The JDA responds to this situation." So, I'm going to start with a definition, and then I'm going to actually give their examples, because I think all of these examples are very helpful. So, their definition is, quote, "Antisemitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish." Okay? So, very clear and concise. So it has all the features that you need. It talks about targeting Jewish people or Jewish institutions, and it talks about targeting them for their Jewishness.
Right. It's about being the matter of the prejudice, which is targeted at somebody just for being who they are and enacting their culture and beliefs in life.
Right.
And I really appreciate that, because that's something that is lost otherwise.
And so, I feel like it's both shorter and more precise and specific than the IHRA definition. So once again, I'm gonna read the IHRA definition, which defines anti-Semitism as, quote, "a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities." So that definition doesn't actually, like, it says that it may be expressed as hatred, but it just says it's a certain perception of Jews, but doesn't really define what specific perception they're talking about.
There's a lot of interpretation in there.
Now, obviously, the IHRA examples flesh that out a bit more, sometimes in problematic ways. But the Jerusalem Declaration fleshes this out by providing a series of 15 guidelines that both provide examples and sort of answer a lot of common questions here. The guidelines are grouped into 3 sections. The first section is sort of general guidelines. Number 1, it is racist to essentialize, treat a character trait as inherent, or to make sweeping negative generalizations about a given population. What is true of racism in general is true of anti-Semitism in particular. 2, what is particular in classic anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews are linked to the forces of evil. This stands at the core of many anti-Jewish fantasies, such as the idea of a Jewish conspiracy in which the Jews possess hidden power that they use to promote their own collective agenda at the expense of other people. This linkage between Jews and evil continues in the present. In the fantasy that the Jews control governments with a hidden hand, that they own the banks, control the media, act as a state within a state, and are responsible for spreading disease such as COVID-19. All these features can be instrumentalized by different and even antagonistic political causes. Number 3, anti-Semitism can be manifested in words, visual images, and deeds. Examples of anti-Semitic words include utterances that all Jews are wealthy, inherently stingy, or unpatriotic. In anti-Semitic caricatures, Jews are often depicted as grotesque, with big noses and associated with wealth. Examples of anti-Semitic deeds are assaulting someone because he or she is Jewish, attacking a synagogue, daubing swastikas on Jewish graves, or refusing to hire or promote people because they're Jewish. Number 4, anti-Semitism can be direct or indirect, explicit or coded. For example, the Rothschilds control the world is a coded statement about the alleged power of the Jews over banks and international finance. Similarly, portraying Israel as the ultimate evil or grossly exaggerating its actual influence can be a coded way of racializing and stigmatizing Jews. In many cases, identifying coded speech as is a matter of context and judgment, taking account of these guidelines. Number 5, denying or minimizing the Holocaust by claiming that the deliberate Nazi genocide of the Jews did not take place, or that there were no extermination camps or gas chambers, or that the number of victims was a fraction of the actual total, is anti-Semitic. So that's the general section there with those 5 guidelines, and I think those are all great. Those are very specific, and they give lots of examples that we can draw from, and we can including giving the example of some people who will criticize Israel in a way that is anti-Semitic, right?
Right.
And we're going to get into that in more detail right here. So section B is Israel and Palestine, examples that, on the face of it, are anti-Semitic. So, number 6, applying the symbols, images, and negative stereotypes of classical anti-Semitism, see guidelines 2 and 3, to the state of Israel. So, for example, just swapping out classic Jewish caricatures, what's that guy's name? That 4chan image.
I have no idea.
It's the Nazi.
Hippie the Frog?
No. What's it called? I'm obviously not a scholar of racism.
Thank goodness.
The Happy Merchant. That's the thing that I was thinking of. It's an anti-Semitic image that's popularized on 4chan. It's sort of a person who is presumably Jewish rubbing his hands. I think he's wearing a yarmulke and has a big nose and a beard. It's called The Happy Merchant.
It's not a new image.
No, it's not, but it's extremely popular on 4chan. So associating an image like that, a classic anti-Semitic image, with the state of Israel in some way, that would be anti-Semitic. Okay. So, number 7, holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct, or treating Jews, simply because they are Jewish, as agents of Israel. That would be anti-Semitic. And that is a classic kind of trope. You actually saw a similar trope with criticism of JFK, for example, for being a Catholic. He was
I think it's just as ridiculous as thinking that the Pope would control the states if the president is Catholic.
Yeah. Number 8, requiring people, because they are Jewish, to publicly condemn Israel or Zionism, for example, at a political meeting. That would be anti-Semitic. Number 9, assuming that non-Israeli Jews, simply because they are Jews, are necessarily more loyal to Israel than to their own countries. And number 10, denying the right of Jews in the state of Israel to exist and flourish collectively and individually as Jews in accordance with the principle of equality. So that one, to color this in more specifically, if you believe that the state of Israel should be removed or not a state or whatever, and that Jews should be removed from that state, that is anti-Semitic. Nobody who I am on friendly terms with, who is an anti-Palestinian rights, none of them believe that. None of them want Jewish people to leave historic Palestine. They just want equality for Palestinians and Israelis, everybody in historic Palestine. They want equal rights and equal representation and a pluralistic state where everybody can live together in harmony. So if you think that Jews should be expelled from the state of Israel, then that is anti-Semitic. Okay? That makes sense to me. Just to be clear, it makes sense to me that that is anti-Semitic, right? You shouldn't want a people just by dint of who they are to be expelled from a country. So now we get on to section C, Israel and Palestine, examples that, on the face of it, are not anti-Semitic, whether or not one approves of the view or action. So this is an especially useful section, I think. This is the last section of their guidelines. You don't have to agree with the criticisms of the state of Israel that are levied here in order to agree that they are not anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Okay. So, number 11. Supporting the Palestinian demand for justice and the full grant of their political, national, civil, and human rights as encapsulated in international law. That is not anti-Semitic. Number 12. Criticizing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism, or arguing for a variety of constitutional arrangements for Jews and Palestinians in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. It is not anti-Semitic to support arrangements that accord full equality to all inhabitants between the river and the sea, whether in two states, a binational state, a unitary democratic state, federal state, or in whatever form.
Hence, that's
very clear.
Not anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Number 13. Evidence-based criticism of Israel as a state. This includes its institutions and founding principles. It also includes its policies and practices, domestic and abroad, such as the conduct of Israel in the West Bank and Gaza, the role Israel plays in the region, or any other way in which, as a state, it influences events in the world. It is not anti-Semitic to point out systematic racial discrimination. In general, the same norms of debate that apply to other states and to other conflicts over national self-determination apply in the case of Israel and Palestine. Thus, even if contentious, it is not anti-Semitic in and of itself to compare Israel with other historic cases, including settler colonialism or apartheid. Number 14. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions are commonplace, non-violent forms of political protest against states. In the Israeli case, they are not, in and of themselves, anti-Semitic. And number 15, political speech does not have to be measured, proportional, tempered, or reasonable to be protected under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights and other human rights instruments. Criticism that some may see as excessive or contentious, or as reflecting a double standard, is not, in and of itself, anti-Semitic. In general, the line between anti-Semitic and non-anti-Semitic speech is different from the line between unreasonable and reasonable speech.
Wow, that's a really important distinction there.
So there are lots of references, frequently asked questions, and signatories, which include hundreds of scholars of anti-Semitism, Jewish studies, and the like, as I described earlier. We'll link to these in the show notes if you want to peruse more details, the full definition, the full preamble, which I excerpted earlier, and all of these guidelines are available at jerusalemdeclaration.org. So, with that in mind, I'd like to respond to a couple other things that have kind of come up in the wake of my valedictory address. So one of the things that was often brought up is, with all the conflict and injustice in the world, from the oppression of the Uyghurs in China to the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the civil wars in Sudan and Syria, why criticize Israel and Israel alone in your valedictory address? So the implication of this question seems to be that criticism of Israel's actions can only be grounded in anti-Semitism. This is untrue.
Pointing them out when so many other injustices are happening proves the...
Yeah, it proves that I've got it out for the Jewish state, right? So as we have sort of laid out in exhaustive detail, I think, with the Jerusalem Declaration, criticizing Israel isn't anti-Semitic. But it is true that it is the only non-Canadian state, I guess, that I called out in specific. I called out settler colonialism in Canada as well, but I did not mention the Uyghurs. I did not mention Sudan and Syria. So why is that? So just to be clear, I do wish for all conflicts worldwide to end. But Israel is indeed a special case, and it has nothing to do with its status as a Jewish state. First, the governments of many Western nations, including both Canada and the United States, are complicit in the ongoing bloodshed perpetrated by Israel in Gaza and the West Bank, in that our governments supply weapons, material, and in some cases, logistical support to the Israel Defense Forces. Canada is not shipping weapons to fighters in Russia or Sudan or Syria. In fact, all of these countries are under embargo. Israel, on the other hand, is not, and Canada continues to supply arms and materiel to the IDF that may be used in killing Palestinian civilians. Now, Minister Joly has just said that maybe this will stop. I don't know, we'll see, but there have been similar promises and votes in Parliament before that have not truly been acted upon. Typically what we see is they'll say, well, we won't approve any new military contracts, but we'll still continue shipping
whatever we approved up till now.
Whatever we approved up till now. Also, we'll ship a bunch...
2025, so...
Yeah, we'll ship a bunch of stuff through the U.S. as well, so we'll see. But regardless, at this moment, we continue to be directly complicit in supplying arms to Israel. That means that political pressure here in North America may directly impact the availability of these armaments that Israeli forces are using to kill children in Gaza right now. So that is one reason why it is very important for us to speak out in specific about this conflict, is one of many reasons. But that is one reason why it is important to speak out, because we have the ability to effect change here.
Yeah, our government needs to know that the people that they are supposed to represent are not in agreement with its actions.
Yes. Second, there is strong evidence that Israel is deliberately targeting healthcare facilities and healthcare workers in Gaza, to an extent not seen in previous conflicts. While there have been calls for ceasefire from many respected international medical organizations, including the World Health Organization and Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, this can be contrasted, as I mentioned in my address, starkly with silence from prominent medical organizations in Canada, including the Canadian Medical Association that I used to be a member of. I have discontinued my membership, and Doctors Manitoba, two organizations that have generally called for peace, non-specifically, but have not called for specifically a ceasefire in Gaza. While Canadian medical organizations have put out statements calling for protection of healthcare workers and patients in Ukraine, they've generally not done so when it comes to the Palestinian territories. It is not that access to medical care in Gaza is more important than access to medical care anywhere else. It's that it is also important. It is equally important. And Canadian medical organizations like the CMA and Doctors Manitoba have treated Gaza differently in that they have not called for an end to the conflict. They have not called for unrestricted access to medical aid in Gaza, but they have done so when it comes to Ukraine, for example. So, in my valedictory address, I was critical of a government's actions in a military campaign that has resulted in tens of thousands of civilian deaths and has prevented access to safe medical care and humanitarian aid. The Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism states that evidence-based criticism of Israel as a state, including the conduct of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories, is not anti-Semitic. What's more, I worry that if you equate criticism of the IDF or the Israeli government with anti-Semitism, you're trivializing real instances of anti-Semitism that do occur. You're crying wolf. Everybody can see that there are atrocities going on in Gaza and the West Bank right now. And if you say, no, talking about those, that's anti-Semitic, it causes people to stop taking accusations of anti-Semitism seriously. And that's bad. It is vitally important that we bear in mind that the military action in Gaza is being carried out by the armed forces of a particular nationalist government, according to the policies of that government, and not by the Jewish people as a whole. I was careful in my comments to criticize the Israeli government and not the people of Israel or the Jewish people as a whole. I've endeavored to make it clear in my criticism that it is criticism of governmental and military policy, not the individual citizens of those governments. Those who conflate the two, as critics of my valedictory address have, work to silence the voices of Jewish people who are working tirelessly for peace. And they also carry water for anti-Semites who would like to lay the ongoing genocide at the feet of all Jews, rather than the political leadership and military apparatus of a specific country and its allies. I have always been open to discussion on this point, and again, I encourage our listeners to provide feedback, especially if they disagree. But frankly, I don't understand how a simple criticism of the policy of a foreign government can be viewed as anti-Semitic. It's probably also worth pointing out the double standard here. I have seen many doctors openly criticize Russia's aggression in Ukraine and the damage to the Okhmydit Children's Hospital caused by Russian forces. Is that criticism Russophobic? Is that racist against Russians? No, you're criticizing a governmental action. Right? I've seen many doctors condemn the actions of Iran during this conflict and during several other conflicts. Does this criticism similarly amount to Islamophobia against Shia Muslims? Iran is, to my knowledge, the only state founded on the principles of Shia Islam. Is that Islamophobic to criticize Iran? No. International human rights organizations agree that Israel is carrying out a genocide. The matter is before the International Court of Justice with a preliminary finding that genocide is plausible, and the UN Special Rapporteur has concluded that there are, quote, reasonable grounds to believe the threshold indicating Israel's commission of genocide is met.
And genocide is plausible is not something that they come to lightly.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's one of those things where I feel like they try really hard not to have to say it, because then that triggers a whole other set of events. Right.
Well, and they don't want the same situation as Jem is talking about, where if they say this is genocide too often, people won't take them seriously.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've talked a lot about anti-Semitism, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about something different. Since my valedictory address in May, I've been the target of dozens of complaints to the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Manitoba, that's my regulatory college, claiming that my speech was anti-Semitic. In a letter to the college, the National Council of Canadian Muslims provided a definition of anti-Palestinian racism that is helpful to bear in mind when evaluating these types of claims. And they suggest that claims of anti-Semitism are being weaponized intentionally to cause a chilling effect on discourse critical of Israel's conduct where Palestinians are concerned. So I'm going to quote from the National Council of Canadian Muslims here. Quote, Anti-Palestinian racism refers to discriminatory attitudes and practices specifically targeting Palestinians or those who advocate for their rights. This form of racism often manifests as systemic barriers and social exclusion of individuals who express support of Palestinian self-determination and human rights, and frequently manifests in the intentional mischaracterization of critiques of the Israeli state as antisemitism. APR intersects with and contributes greatly to expressions of Islamophobia, but notably also impacts non-Muslims and non-Palestinian allies who speak up. Professionals across the country, including physicians, are facing reprisal for speaking out about Palestinian human rights, which is causing a chilling effect on critical discourse. These disciplinary proceedings and investigations often appear to involve a targeted weaponization of the complaints and/or regulatory process, rather than bona fide concerns made in good faith. For years, we have heard from professionals across the country who have been sounding the alarm that they face professional, regulatory, and disciplinary consequences in schools and workplaces for speaking up about Palestinian human rights. Over the last 11 months, we have seen firsthand many cases where the disciplinary process is weaponized to curtail legitimate expression. This chilling effect has been documented by many organizations, including ours. In fact, 1 year prior to the events of October 7, 2023, Independent Jewish Voices, a grassroots organization grounded in the Jewish tradition that opposes all forms of hate and advocates for justice and peace for all, released a thoroughly researched report entitled Unveiling the Chilly Climate: The Suppression of Speech on Palestine in Canada. This 96-page report highlighted what Palestinian activists and humanitarians have known for years, and what has become worse over the last year. There are ongoing efforts to delegitimize and quash support for the human rights of the Palestinian people, most notably targeting individuals, academic institutions, and vocational organizations. The report also describes the phenomenon of professionals facing coordinated harassment campaigns to stifle speech critical of the Israeli government's human rights violations. I'll end the quote there. So, the attack of October 7th was brutal and unjustifiable. Civilians are not legitimate military targets, and many civilians were killed on October 7th. I would never condone, justify, or defend the actions of the Hamas militants who planned or participated in the October 7th attacks, which resulted in hundreds of civilian deaths. It is also true that the Israeli military response has resulted in many tens of thousands of civilian deaths, with roughly half of those deaths being children. While I condemn the Hamas October 7th attack, that attack was no longer ongoing at the time of my valedictory address, while the IDF military action in Gaza was ongoing, and is ongoing to this day. Given that the aim of my valedictory address was to advocate for promoting health and removing barriers to access to healthcare, I chose to focus my comments on the ongoing military action that reports have found continue to cause civilian deaths, and include the targeting of healthcare facilities and healthcare workers. Reports from physicians working on the ground back up the reporting from organizational sources. For example, on October 11th, 2024, roughly a month before my valedictory address, Dr. Mark Perlmutter, who's a Jewish American surgeon, spoke to news outlets about his work in Gaza over the previous weeks. He described the hospital he worked at as hanging on by a thread, and he reported seeing countless Gazan children who had been shot in the head by Israeli snipers. I referred to Israel's military campaign as genocidal, and I think that it was perhaps this statement that caused the most offense. But that contention is factual. Israel's conduct toward the people of Palestine is overtly genocidal. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's called Palestinians the people of darkness, and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has called them human animals. This kind of dehumanization is one of the cornerstones of fascism. Countless human rights groups, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the University Network for Human Rights, agree that Israel is carrying out a genocide. South Africa's submission to the International Court of Justice lays out the arguments in exhaustive detail, and while we may have to wait years for the ICJ to make a final ruling on the matter, their preliminary finding that genocide is plausible has been widely publicized. Since my valedictory address, International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim A. Khan has requested arrest warrants for both of these individuals, both Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu, for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The charges against them include intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population, starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, extermination, and murder as a war crime. Arrest warrants were also issued for 3 Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Diab Ibrahim al-Masri, and Ismail Haniyeh for their involvement in the October 7th attack. As some listeners are no doubt aware, Haniyeh was later assassinated in Iran by an Israeli airstrike. I hope that the other 4 of these individuals live to see their day at the ICC. I want a ceasefire. I want the hostages held by both Israel and Hamas to be released. I want this genocide to end. I want the unjust occupation of Palestinian land to end. I hope to see peace, prosperity, and justice for all people in historic Palestine. And that's it. So this has been a little bit longer than part 1. But if that's kind of, I feel like now we could all use something nice.
Sounds good.
So I've been talking a lot. Somebody else go.
An amazing trip to Europe. I was able to attend a conference with lots of other women from around the world talking about peace. It was not an uplifting conference, but I felt solidarity with other folks there who are having the same feelings and encountering the same problems, and being able to go on that adventure as well was amazing. I saw some beautiful things and got to explore the country a little bit. It was a wonderful time and also a time of reflection, especially talking about Ukrainian refugees when you're 3 or 4 hour drive from the border is just a little bit different.
I bet. Yeah.
Yeah, my something nice is that I had the ability to go on that trip, and even though I brought back COVID as my souvenir.
If listeners are wondering why Ashlyn sounds more like a robot than usual, is because
I have a vacant stare 'cause I'm a robot.
this episode was recorded remotely.
Make it sound reasonable. We appreciate you.
Yeah.
We appreciate you lots.
My something nice is that Ashlyn is home.
Aw, that's
It was-
lovely.
It was a long, more than a week that she was gone, so. And we had to do a lot at the garden in the meantime, so getting that done. Not appreciating the souvenir that came home with her. This is both Ashlyn's and mine first time having COVID, but that is also in itself, I don't want to say it's a something nice. We've been able to avoid it this long. Do not wish it on anyone. Now that Ashlyn,
Flying is a mistake.
now that Ashlyn is almost back to about 70%, she's been taking good care of me. So thank you, honey.
That is a lie. You have refused to allow me to do anything.
That's about all I got. So thanks, folks. That's why I sound like this.
No, all good. My something nice was, well, it's kind of a double something nice. Last weekend, got to go to my family's annual games day, which was fun and nice. Got to see some people that I don't get to see that often anymore. Grew up with, but our family's gotten bigger and spread out, and so we just don't get to see people as much. And so it's nice to spend some time playing silly backyard games together. So that was fun. And then my other something nice is this coming weekend, our immediate family, just us 4, are going on a little retreat. Jem had the opportunity to do that with his work, and so we're all going on a little trip out of town and going to enjoy a nice little resort. So that'll be fun.
Cool.
Yeah, it'll be a little bit of a working vacation for me, but not much. Mostly fun times with the family and some other residents. So I'm looking forward to that too.
Sounds lovely.
My something nice. I don't know. I've gone back and forth. I have had the opportunity to read with my kids a lot more lately, which has been nice, and to play games. I was playing chess with Kira just a couple hours ago before bedtime, and that was lovely. But I've talked about that before, so something different. Laura and I have been watching a television show on Apple TV Plus or whatever it's called Bad Monkey, based on the Carl Hiaasen novel of the same name, and it's really fun. I've really been enjoying it. It is intermittently faithful to the source material, to the book. I think it is better and a little less racist than the book. I think the author is kind of doing his best, but I would say some missteps in the book. But regardless, I think the show is lots of fun, has a great cast. Like Vince Vaughn is surprisingly excellent as the lead. Yeah, it's a fun sort of murder mystery, police style procedural romp. Very funny, very fun, and some rich bad people get it in the end. Oh, and it also has Rob Delaney in it, who I always love.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Sorry, Ashlyn, you think you were saying something?
No, I was just laughing. Mostly at the thought that, sure, Rob Delaney, I definitely know who that is.
Okay, so Rob Delaney he's probably best known, he's a comedian. He's probably best known as, in Deadpool 2 and Deadpool 3, he's Deadpool's like very normal kind of loser buddy. He is one of the two leads in the British comedy show Catastrophe.
So good.
Which is just such a good show.
So good.
Like that show, okay, maybe that show is now my something nice. God, we should watch that again.
We should watch that again. Also, Carrie Fisher makes several cameos, and she's excellent in that show. So
yeah, Catastrophe. Oh man, great British comedy show. But yeah, my something nice is Bad Monkey.
Lovely.
This Vince Vaughn vehicle. Okay, well, this has been a bit of a grim one. Let's try something a little bit less heavy next time, shall we?
Yeah, that seems good.
sure.
Okay, well, thanks for joining me tonight, everybody.
Good night.
Folks.
Thank
Talk to you next
you.
time.
Okay, be kind to each other. Good night. Show notes and references for all of our episodes are available at lueepodcast.com, where you can also find links to donate or get in touch. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is with a review on Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you found us, or by sharing this episode with a friend.